Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the Qredible live broadcast on this sunny February day. We are so excited to have Laurie Parfitt with us today. You probably know her. I'm sure plenty of people in our audience do. I'll give a little bit of a brief intro, and then we're going to hear from Laurie about Laurie, which is great. She is the Principal Chief Executive Officer at LKP.
Easy for you to say.
I know I was going to stumble over that. Impact Consulting, and has a rich background in this industry in the cannabis and consumer product space. She is an avid public speaker, so she has, headlined a lot of the cannabis events and has been a fractional CMO and has worked in commercial strategy and execution, helping companies extract value and position themselves for growth. So we are so happy to have you here, Laurie, and I apologize. LKP.
Oh, no worries. People do that all the time. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're thrilled you're here. So why don't we, like I said, let Laurie talk about Laurie. Give us a little bit of on your background, your journey, and then kind of journey into the cannabis marketing space and about yourself. So
all right. Well, thank you, Joy. And thank you to you all for being here today. So as said, I'm Laurie Parfitt with LKP Impact Consulting. We're a fractional CMO firm. My background is very strong in consumer products and the cannabis space. I have worked across multiple functional areas in my career. So I started my career in finance, moved over into sales and operations, and then on to marketing. And marketing is truly my passion. I really love to work on, how does the consumer think? How do you create impactful campaigns that inspire and engage consumers? From a business-to-business perspective, I love working in that field as well. I do a lot on the technology side, as well as working with ancillary businesses and how do you promote yourself the right way. So I had 17 years in CPG. Prior to that, I worked in financial services. And then coming out of CPG, I had spent about 5 years working for Ragu and Bertolli. They are a division of MizCon America. They had been purchased by MizCon from Unilever back in 2014, and I helped with the startup of that organization. I'd been there for about 5 years, and my mentor, who I had worked with at a private label product cooperative years ago, called me up one day, and he needed a reference for a cannabis company. And I was like, this is really interesting. And he's like, well, if I get it, you're coming with me. And he did get it. And so I joined him. And, I had been in consumer products most of my career. And one of the things I learned very quickly about myself is that I am a high risk, high reward kind of person. I really like to build things from the bottom. I like to take chances and take risks. And to go into the cannabis space, which was so new and exciting, I couldn't pass that opportunity up. So I actually joined Forefront Ventures. I ran marketing and customer experience for them for their 10 dispensaries across 6 states. I learned, it was, baptism by fire. They threw me right in and I had to kind of learn on the fly. But I mean, that's sort of the industry. We build the plane as it's taking off here. And once we went through the capital markets crisis in early 2020, right before COVID, they were definitely impacted by that. And I found myself wondering what I was going to do next. And so I started my own consulting practice. And so, like I said, I'm a fractional CMO. Our firm helps brands, operators, technology, and ancillary services who don't need or can't afford full-time marketing. We always say it's everything you need for marketing at a fraction of the cost. And so that is what I have found has worked really well in the cannabis space, because most cannabis companies, it's very challenging to be able to afford a full-time CMO and a full-time marketing team, and being able to provide that within this kind of regulatory environment has been exciting, challenging, and really effective.
Well, Laurie, I'm going to start by challenging you on something. You said in a recent podcast, maybe it was a year ago, I forget what it was, but you'd said that you were working in promoting pasta sauce, and you said and what you love about the cannabis industry is it's a healthy thing and it's life changing, and pasta sauce isn't life changing. So I have to take exception to that. Being raised by an Italian woman who made amazing pasta sauce. It is life changing.
Maybe you should go work for Ranku and Bertoli. I think they would love to hear that.
No, but it was so funny when because you've been a tremendous advocate of the industry, of the cannabis industry, and you're right. I mean, it's and part of what I really want to talk about today is about your journey, because what I've learned about you in a very short period of time is you are all about the journey. And you are all about learning along the way, and about discovering, and not afraid to be vulnerable, and being courageous, and really learning the things that you don't know about to become expert in, and not being afraid to fail. So these are, I mean, it almost encapsulates what this industry is all about. This is such a nascent industry, and coming from those old consumer sort of brand products, and now getting into, like, you've got like 100 years of stigma to erase or educate on in this industry. Like, your challenges in this industry are way different than selling pasta sauce. So talk to us a little bit about that and your journey in this industry, and how you see the challenges in this industry very different than other consumer products.
I think that's a great question. And, I had a little taste of highly regulated earlier on. I worked for Beam Suntory, so I come from the liquor space as well. And one of the things we always thought was so interesting is, we always used to ask each other, what must have been like to come out of Prohibition?
Yeah.
And the cannabis space is exactly what that is. And when I joined the cannabis space, it was really interesting. One of the first conversations I had with someone, and I say this a lot, is they said to me, everything we do in this industry will impact it 10, 50, 100 years from now. So don't screw it up.
Right. No pressure.
No, exactly. And, coming from CPG, the initial thought is that you can transfer everything you know from CPG into cannabis. Mm-hmm. And that is not accurate at all. I think the most successful people coming from CPG or any other industry into cannabis realize that it's a very different industry. The regulations are incredibly different. What you can and cannot do is very different. And you need to look at your experience and say, what do I need to take with me? And what do I have to leave behind? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to leave behind some of those key things that were instrumental in consumer products, but you can't even do in cannabis. And that's okay. And so the cannabis industry is definitely a different animal, but in some ways, it's definitely highly regulated. It can be challenging, but it's also simpler. And so when you work in consumer products and you're in marketing and you have millions of dollars worth of budget, you can do whatever kind of marketing you want. I mean, for the most part. And when I was in pasta sauce, last I checked, pasta sauce was legal in every state of the union. And so I could put it on TV, I could put it on the radio, I could do anything I really wanted on social as long as I wasn't being offensive. I could do any kind of digital. The options were endless. And the problem in marketing is that the options are endless. And there's so many different things you can do. And trying to sift through that can be a full-time job in and of itself. In the cannabis space, it's very different. Your options are limited. You are within the framework that has been created for you. And I would say in the past 5 years, from what I started to where I am now, we have grown exponentially and the options have definitely expanded. But still, the rules and regulations are very much the same. And much of what I took into this industry, I took from the liquor industry. So in the liquor industry, even though it is federally legal, you have a very fragmented marketplace. You have open states, franchise markets, control states. They all operate differently. They all have different laws, and you have to be very cognizant of how you work within them. It's a 3-tier distribution model, so you can't go direct to consumers. There's a lot of different nuances there. And a lot of that experience has translated better for me into the space versus the pasta sauce category. And so I learned how to be very scrappy. And I think the key to being successful in cannabis is to be very scrappy, because the budgets you have in cannabis are not like they were in CPG. And one of the biggest misnomers coming in here is, I hear this from my colleagues across CPG all the time. Well, I want to be in the cannabis space. That's where all the money is. Yeah. That's everybody's, raking it in and making tons of cash. And I always say, I'm like, if that's what you think, you're going to be sadly disappointed because the
Yeah.
cannabis industry is really challenging. Capital is tight. The regulations are extreme. And you have to learn how to do a lot with a little or nothing.
Well, that's interesting because you actually took some of the challenges of the industry and you boiled it down and said, but there are also opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
and it actually reduces a little bit of the complexity, um, because you have a smaller box in which you can operate. So instead of this, as you said, marketing a pasta sauce where there's lots you can do, and paralleling that to the liquor industry is I think really interesting. And here's the interesting parallel. So almost as long as liquor has been legal, cannabis has been illegal.
Yep.
And that has just created this so many years of stigma and misinformation about the product. So when you think about that, you've got the traditional. I've heard you once talk about sort of the Harley Davidson, consumer, right? And how they're the diehards, the original, very specific profile. But yet the doctors and the lawyers wanted to start to drive a Harley, and it became, very, very different. And there's got to be some similarity there in sort of marketing this thing called cannabis, because I think there's a lot of closet consumers out there that, they're not coming out of the closet right away with this, saying, hey, I'm a cannabis user, or I want to be. So part of it is getting rid of the stigma, mainstreaming this, and aligning the messaging to them where it's not like, this isn't Cheech and Chong or Fast Times at Ridgemont High. That's maybe one consumer, but there's a whole, I mean, I've been talking to my 90-year-old, mother about it, where it was always taboo about, maybe using it to help sleep and those types of things. And she's actually open to the conversation at 90 years old when, and that's that's another segment of the market. So as you're building these personas have to keep changing and be, what are your thoughts about all that?
So I understand what you're saying. And so you're talking about the prime prospect.
Right.
And so when you think about a bullseye, when you play darts, I assume you've played at least once.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you aim?
Right to the center.
Exactly. And so that center is your prime prospect. And that is your consumer most difficult to delight. And that is who you have to focus on. And everything you do needs to be around that consumer, because if you get that consumer, you get everybody else. If you miss that consumer, you might get another consumer, but it won't be your prime prospect, and it won't give you the market that you're looking for. So like I used to hear when we would always target the millennial consumer, the millennials in the bullseye. Well, I don't want to forget about the Gen Xers, and I don't want to alienate the baby boomers, but you won't, because the millennial was driving the trend. So when you think about a trendsetter, when you think about asking people, what's the hot new trend out there? Do you go to your parents? No, probably not. But
No.
your parents come to you. Yes. So
I'm very trendy. I'm a trendsetter. So.
I believe it. I see that. But that's who your prime prospect is. And in traditional industries recently, we've actually seen brands tank because they forgot who their prime prospect was. We just saw this happen with Bud Light. And this is not a commentary on how they shifted. This is a commentary on they had a very strong prime prospect, and they tried to walk away from that prime prospect. And the truth is, everybody who buys that brand is being driven by that prime prospect. It's people who want to be like that person. And so there are ways to invite people into your brands and welcome people into your brands without shifting who your prime prospect is. So yes, there's different personas, and you can have a prime prospect, a secondary prospect, a tertiary prospect. But at the end of the day, you have to stay incredibly focused on who your core consumer is, or you will lose them. And if you lose them, you are likely to lose everybody else too.
That's incredibly helpful. And then on top of that, now you've got the challenges of what you can and cannot say, where you can say it, where you can't say it. And, and I think it's very difficult for like smaller brands, for example, to compete in that, tremendously compliance driven, market. So, what are some of your advice on how a smaller brand can compete sort of with these bigger brands with bigger budgets where they spend a lot of money on branding?
So first and foremost, I'm not sure there's anybody who's spending a ton of money on brands. Even your multi-state operators, I think, are very budget conscious. And I worked for one, and they definitely were. It's just a sort of a function of the industry. But the first thing I tell everybody to do is really hone in on your brand strategy. Like you have to go back to basics. Cannabis is different than other industries, but in some respects, it's the same. A consumer is a consumer. And so you should be approaching your brand strategy the same way in cannabis that you do in CPG and alcohol, in any other kind of category. So what that really means is you start with that prime prospect. You build out who that person is. You move into your brand pyramid. What are your points of parity? How are you like other brands? Moving into how are you different than other brands, which I think is really where the rubber meets the road. I have seen many brands not be able to talk about what their true points of differentiation are. And they have to be more than pretty packaging or a unique flavor. It really has to be something interesting, like you have fast acting. That's not as much of a differentiator right now, but for a while, it was a huge differentiator. Then you ladder up to the brand promise. What are you promising consumers every time they interact with your brand? What kind of response do you want from them? And then your brand essence, which is the tip of the pyramid, which to me is the most important part of your brand. And if you skip this, your brand will have no feel to it, no soul to it. And the brand essence is the emotion you want people to feel when they interact with your brand. And it's truly an emotion. And if you cannot define that emotion, the emotion does not exist. And so I hear lots of brands out there who will say, it's just a feeling. And everybody's kind of on board with the feeling. I'm like, if you can't define the feeling, it doesn't exist.
So what you're saying is if you're laser focused on the primary target, right? And starting from that level, you're not trying to be all things to all people. You're really trying to zero in on the core messaging and then differentiate from there. Is that sort of the message?
Yes. So you really want to focus in on that core consumer. You want to build a robust brand strategy with strong positioning, a strong brand voice before even going to a logo, to a tagline, to packaging. I see this with brands across industries. They get really excited. An entrepreneur starts out and they're like, I have this great idea. And the first thing they want to do is kind of bring it to life, make it visual for themselves. And so they hire a designer and they're like, build me a logo, build me a tagline, build me some packaging design. But designers are very talented, but they're only as good as the content they're provided. Right. And if they get your branding right, the chances are it's just luck. Generally speaking, they need to feel your brand. They need to understand the ethos of your brand. And if you can do the brand strategy work before you move to them, you'll be that much more effective. And your brand will actually emote what you're trying to put out there in the world. And that makes you more effective. From there, in order to compete, you really need to look at your marketing levers: digital, social, PR, out of home. Determine what are those key pillars going to look like for you, and how do you want to activate, and how do you want to make sure you stay on brand message.
So let's talk about those differences for a minute, because I get called in a lot by investors on due diligence teams, right?
Okay.
So I was just on one of these calls this week where, there's a company that wants to invest money in a new wholesale, brand grower, right? And so I get called in on these due diligence teams to help out and ask all the hard questions, and because I understand the industry. And one of the things that everybody kind of talks about is, I say, so what's your key differentiator? What is going to differentiate your brand out of everybody else? And everybody always says quality. We're a quality product. So, I mean, I know that consumers are obviously looking for quality, but isn't that like table stakes? Like they're assuming you're not going to be making a crappy product. Like,
So to me, it's exactly what it is. So there's a difference between brand differentiator and customer expectation. So think about a restaurant, for example. Do you ever hear a restaurant say, our kitchen is disgusting, but our food is amazing? You should come here. No. A consumer expects the kitchen to be clean.
right.
Whether it is or it's not, we still expect that. We still expect quality in a product. Nobody wants to buy a product that isn't high quality. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Nobody's like, oh, that's a crappy product, I'm going to go buy that. That's low quality, I'm going to go buy that. They want to, depending on what tier you're in, you want to make sure you're getting the highest quality product for what you can afford. So quality is not a differentiator. I had a brand once tell me, we keep a clean lab. I'm like, another, consumer expectation. You can't sell that. Nobody's saying our lab's a mess, but our product's great.
Right.
So you really
have tagline shouldn't be our food doesn't suck, right?
Right. And so at the end of the day, your differentiator has to be a real differentiator. I was coaching for a nonprofit in food and beverage, and I was talking to a coffee company, and I was like, okay, what's the key differentiator of your brand? And she's like, well, we're into motorcycles, and we're going to have motorcycles on our packaging. And I'm like, okay, so is the formulation of your coffee, is it going to be like very high caffeine to make sure that bikers can, stay awake for long stretches on the road? And she's like, no. I'm like, do you have local roasts that are, specific, flavor varieties that bikers like? And she's like, no. She's like, we just want motorcycles on our packaging because we like motorcycles. And I'm like, that is not a differentiator. Right. You have to have a product differentiator. So fast acting, nano encapsulated, has, a CBG or a CBN in it, something that makes your product more unique. Having, a grapefruit flavor versus, your typical strawberry or cherry, that's not enough. You have to have something that's going to make the consumer buy your product over someone else's.
Interesting. And I heard you sort of talk about that. Even some of the big companies aren't spending a lot of money on branding. So a lot of it is just being scrappy and getting the message out there and figuring out those, those core, what I call guerrilla marketing, kind of strategies. Talk to me a little bit about, sort of the difference between a bigger MSO and a smaller business in regard to marketing. And, how do their risks different? How are their priorities different? And how can you help, in both categories?
So they can be very similar, but for the most part, if you're looking at an MSO, so you're looking at a Verano or a PharmaCann or a GTI, for the most part, they have a little bit more capital, a little, more resources. They might have a marketing team, which is amazing. They still want to be scrappy. These are not companies that are going to waste money indiscriminately.
Right.
They want to spend the money where they're going to get the best ROI, but they have more resources to work with. A smaller brand, whether it's an asset light brand or whether you're a small operator that is manufacturing a brand, they have to be even more scrappy than a multi-state operator. Multi-state operators are generally more funded. These smaller brands, what I see a lot is, they can't afford marketing teams. They can barely afford a marketing manager. And so where they have to really think is, what are those key things going to be that they need to focus on? How do they get the most from their dollars? How do they ensure they're not overspending, but making sure that they can get some of that scale that they need and brand awareness that they need to be effective? Mm-hmm. What I tell a lot of these companies, you don't have to spend a ton of money on marketing. You can do it pretty reasonably.
But you do have to spend some money. And I've done some due diligence on some companies, and I've seen crazy marketing budgets. And in some cases, I've seen zero marketing. Like And I would ask, like, how much is in that budget for marketing? And they'd be like, well, we really can't afford marketing. And I say, well, you really can't afford not to do marketing. So
Exactly.
what's your strategy of getting it done, at the right price? And that's really what your company's all about.
Yes. And so what I learned really early in the industry, so when I started with the multi-state operator, in traditional industries, the average tenure of a CMO is 18 months. That's pharma, CPG, alcohol. In cannabis, it's about 6.
Wow.
And even with the MSOs, you see them run through marketing people really quickly. Part of that is because they take people from big CPGs who are used to big marketing budgets, and then they're like, wait, I don't have a marketing budget. I can't hire an agency. What is this? And so when I started my company, I realized that very quickly. And so if you were to hire a full-time CMO worth their salt in anything, you're spending at least, 350, 400,000 for them between their salary, their benefits, their bonus, their equity. That's about what they're going to cost, likely. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these CMOs, we're not experts in everything. So I always take it to the medical profession. They all get a basic medical education. They're all doctors, but then they specialize. Someone becomes a dermatologist. Someone becomes a cardiologist. You wouldn't go to your dermatologist to ask about your heart condition. Marketers aren't that different. We specialize. And so certain marketers specialize in digital. Some marketers specialize in branding. Some marketers are field and consumer trade marketers. And the likelihood that you're going to find a CMO that's an expert in every facet of marketing is pretty much 0. And so when you hire that CMO, the first thing they're going to want to do is they're going to want to fill in their gaps. And that whether that's an agency, whether that's hiring a team. So before you've spent any money on your marketing at all, you've pretty much spent probably at least, $500,000 to $750,000 just to build your team.
Wow. Yeah.
And then you have to think about ad spend on top of that. And so that is cost prohibitive for so many operators. So what we looked at was you don't need a full-time CMO. If you're a small brand, you definitely don't need a full-time CMO. You need someone who can have some of that leadership and can source you or bring in-house some of those other functions at a less expensive cost, and someone who's going to do it in a scrappy way and not try to get you to spend $1 million on digital marketing or buy billboards in every jurisdiction that you're in. You have to be cost conscious and do things in an effective way.
Well, Laurie, I think that's what I really like about your style, and I like about what you're doing is, first of all, because you are a scrappy entrepreneur. I mean, when you boil it down, you've had the courage to get out there. You've had the courage to put it all on the line, and you're one of these people that just makes it happen and figures it out, and does so in a way that's not going to cost everybody a whole lot of money and put their business at risk. And it's really why we wanted you on the show, because I think we're describing a lot of our customers and a lot of our industry out there is, they're struggling with so many areas, and the money isn't just free flowing in this industry. I mean, there's still an issue with capital. We're starting to see that loosen up a little bit in this industry, which is great. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be tulip time when, that opens up and then the money's going to be flowing all over the place. It's going to be very important to spend this money right and spend this money in a scrappy way. I'd love to have you back on sometime and talk about the entrepreneurial journey as well, because we're both fellow entrepreneurs, right? And we've had the courage to get out there and courage or craziness, I'm not quite sure, but it's probably a good combination.
I think it's both.
Yes. and the ability to be vulnerable in that. And I've heard you quote before Dr. Brene Brown about there's no bravery without risk and vulnerability. And you got to either choose courage or comfort, but you can't have both, right?
Not at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time. And that's so very true. And, and I think that a lot of the entrepreneurs I meet in this industry, they're really putting themselves out there. And I have a lot of respect for a lot of these business owners that I work with in this industry. And I think you're a great alternative for them. So tell our audience how they can get in touch with you and how they can learn more about the LKP Look, I did it. Joy did that to me. She made that happen. Just so talk
to level
about
the playing
how they
field.
can subliminally. I can't even say that right. It's Friday afternoon. What do you want?
Yeah.
So just let's talk about how our audience can get in touch with you, because I think they ought to be working with you to make things happen.
Well, I would love that. So you can find me at Laurie, Laurie, at lkpimpact.com. Our website is www.lkpimpact.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. That is great. And I think this has been a great discussion. And as always, when we have such experts like yourself on this show, it goes by so fast. So it's been a great 30 minutes. It's wonderful to spend time with you, Laurie, and we look forward to working closely with you in the future and getting you back on this broadcast at some point. So
And I
thank
do
you
as
so much.
well. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well,
Everybody
thank you.
Good. All right. Thanks, everybody.